Like
It says
Philip
going
Schofield.
live. Yes.
Oh. Hello, everybody.
Hello. Yes. Hello.
I believe we are live.
I believe we are.
Ah,
I hope someone's watching.
Yes. Welcome to Southampton.
Yes.
Not a particularly interesting view behind us, but
No.
don't be distracted by that.
Yeah. And the sun is actually shining today. It's a lovely, sunny, positive day for our live transmission. So welcome to Southampton. And let's hope that we'll hear from a number of you who've followed us on this course. And let's see what questions we can deal with.
Answerable ones. Please.
Answerable ones, yes. Yeah, not too difficult.
No.
That's good. Did you want to begin, Rob, with any particular question, any theme that's come up for you over the 4 weeks so far?
So if we begin by themes, I thought the most interesting thing that's come up that's new on this course, because we tend to get some people who start discussions in new avenues that we haven't gone down before. And I thought one interesting area was knowing the students. And it links to some of the answers to questions that have been posed that I'm going to say later. But I think knowing, but I think knowing what to teach, knowing how to teach it, knowing how to train people to engage with this environment really revolves around knowing the students and how we can understand them. And some participants on the course had very interesting ideas, for example, of when to use questionnaires, types of, or ways that you can access different kinds of knowledge of students. And I wanted to just break it down slightly, because I like to break things down. But,
go ahead.
Thank you.
I'm going to pull them together shortly.
Good. But like, for example, we had the idea of questionnaires at the beginning to access students' ideas, their weaknesses, their preferences, their anxieties, questionnaires in the middle of a course to understand how they're struggling, how they're succeeding, what they're enjoying, what they're not enjoying. So we discussed the use of questionnaires, but I also thought ways of accessing what students know, what students need to know, how well they're formulating ideas for your subject is another interesting area where formative assessments could come in, and we could sort of break down the idea of traditional dialogues. And we mentioned writing in the end of week videos before. And I think writing exists in different ways in universities, but we can have lots of activities that encourage students to write about things, that knowledge they're developing, reflect on their ideas on your courses. And that's also a way of growing their confidence, helping them to develop writing ability at a much smaller level than writing a long assignment, but getting them to communicate with you via a safe communication network where you're not judging their English, you're just asking them to feed in and help you understand their experience. And I think there are many ways that this can be done, but I think it's very interesting to have discussions about how you can know the students and also what you need to know about the students.
Yes.
Because it's sometimes our mind gets focused on satisfaction. Are the students satisfied with the product they're receiving? But as educators, we need to know much more. We need to know what are they understanding, how are they developing, and also when we ask them, we want them to be participating in this dialogue in a way that helps them to improve their language and also their ability to talk about and communicate their ideas. So I think that in the modern university, there's a lot more dialogue, and technology allows much more of this, like discussion boards and ways that students can communicate in real time and over periods of time. They can engage and tell you something about their experience. So I think that's really interesting. And of course, face-to-face communication is not dead. We can also talk to students and learn about their experience and how they perceived your class. Not if you've got 400 students in one lecture hall, but it's again, we have to adapt how we know the students according to our context. So that's been a highlight for me to start thinking about that because it's the foundation of everything we do. How do we know what the students are experiencing from our teaching? What about you, Mary?
Well, I'd like to pick up on that. I have noticed that in this particular run of the MOOC, there has been more emphasis on the student, as you've mentioned, Rob. And I'd like to sort of like pull this over to a question that, I'm sorry, I need my glasses, Amy sent in. What kind of practical language support is useful for lecturers new to using EMI? This course already offers many ideas, but I'd also like to hear more of others' experience, especially those who've been in this position themselves. I'm about to start work on a project aimed at helping this target group and would love to know more about how you got started or what support you wish had been available. Well, there's lots and lots of things that we can pick up in that one single question. We could be talking for an hour about various approaches to Amy's question. But what this reminded me of was not just the progress in themes over the different runs of our MOOC, but also of my own experience many, many years ago. And I'm not going to say how many years ago that was. I was in a similar situation in the sense that I was in France and I had to lecture through the medium of French. I was very young. I had French, proficiency in French that was reasonable, but I wasn't used to speaking in front of a large group of people. I did French at university and we mainly studied literature, things like that. I had very little training in pedagogic approaches to the situation I was in. When I was given this job to do, I could only think of myself. That's the only thing I could think of was myself. How am I going to manage? How am I going to find the words to communicate what I want to say to the students? What if my grammar breaks down, and so on? And if I think back to that situation, I realized that I should have switched it around and come at the problem from a completely different angle. I should have thought first and foremost of the students. What do they need to know? How can I present this material in a way that will be meaningful and accessible to them? And then only later on would I have thought, right, okay, now what words do I need to make that happen? And I think this probably explains my empathy for people having to do the same kind of thing in English, because when I think back to the situation I was in all those years ago in France, I really wasn't thinking of the students at all. So to come to this question that Amy asked, the practical language support for lecturers new to using EMI, yes, you need that, but you've got to start from the students. Think backwards, starting with them and not yourself. And I think if we can get into that habit in this or similar sort of situation, and it's very, very difficult to do, because I know if I had to lecture in French tomorrow, I'd be thumbing through my dictionary and I'd be looking at words and I'd be thinking of language. It's a natural reaction. But if we can put the students first and their needs, establishing their needs, what they need to do and how we can make the experience meaningful and satisfactory for them, then this is the way to go about it. I don't know if you agree with that.
I was going to say there must be something to that. I would assume that everything you say is true, of course.
Well, of course it is.
But I've had the same thing. It's a very short talk, but I gave a talk once just to see if I could do it in Mandarin. And I did exactly the same thing. I thought immediately, what words do I know in Mandarin? What words do I need to look up? And the same thing. It was all about me. I think I broke every principle that I have as an educator.
Yes. Yeah.
And in hindsight, it would be much better because your French, I'm sure, was better than my Mandarin, especially academic Chinese.
Yes.
It would have been much better to lead that session through use of visuals, through handing out quotations and saying, okay, discuss this amongst yourselves. And then we'll manage minimal communication with the person at the front of the room who's really quite a bad communicator. But yeah, I didn't do that. I did the exact reverse and thought, I want control of all the variables in this room. Almost, I'm going to read a script because that's what I can control, and I don't want to make a fool of myself. And absolutely, I completely empathize with that story and think it must happen a lot.
It must do. I think I was fresh out of university in Britain. I was 22 in that situation. And I mean, when I look back, if I could have a video recording of that, I would die of embarrassment. So what I'm saying is that, yes, I understand your question, Amy, and it's the question that a lot of people ask. But if we can try to start with how we're going to manage the session. And remember, the session is not just the session, it's the activities before the session begins. What activities in the form of texts, discussions, video, what can the students do before the session on their own? Perhaps organise people, if it's possible, organise them in groups to get together and work on some texts together or look at a video together. So they have some pre-knowledge to ease the passage into the lecture that you're going to deliver. And then think about what you're going to do after as well. And have this, I think I used the word holistic last week. It must be my word of the month. But a very holistic approach to the whole experience before, during, and after. And then home in on the language I am going to need to make that happen. And then focus on that. So that's my best advice.
And I would add just taking that first question. I think it's a very interesting area, and I'm glad that people are concerned. And Amy here is talking about developing a project that looks at this directly, and I hope lots of people do, because lots of people are employed to support language development of educators. I would also add, I think the important thing in support is what resources are available, because we've been involved with work with universities around the world, and not everyone has the same resources. So the support that can be there differs quite a lot. The other thing is, I think the essential element is personalization. We don't all do the same things in classrooms. When the last sort of training session, educational session, awareness raising session we did in Chile, it was very helpful to have the STEM science-based subjects separated from humanities-based. And just the discussions that we had were very different in terms of our identities as academics. What is it we're doing? What are we trying to do? What kind of students end up in our classroom? In what kind of numbers? So when people are developing their language, I think if, much like teaching students, if it's abstracted from what they're actually trying to communicate, it doesn't work as well as if you can access the language that they need to do their job well in terms of how they want to do it. And again, you have to understand what they don't know, which around the world is very different. Like, people have different concerns. In some first language groups, they're really concerned about pronunciation. Other people will be really annoyed if you talk about pronunciation. It's like, this is my accent. Why are you trying to change my accent? But I think, if that support can, so lots of resources are available, but their relevance depends on the needs of the people who are doing the educating. So our work tends to start with needs analysis. What do you think you need? What do you struggle with? And quite often the language support people want, accompanying EMI, is pressure to publish. And this is a very powerful area as well. So we're talking about how to teach, how to engage students through English. Lots of the people who are employed to lecture through English, their biggest pressure is actually on publication. and you say, what language support do you need? Quite often people say, I need to be able to publish through English. And that's sometimes that's running in the opposite direction of our communicative, okay, how do you create this interpersonal engagement? How do you make people enthusiastic? How do you encourage people to come together? People want to engage with that, but sometimes it's a secondary motivation behind having the English language which is incredibly difficult to write for publication. So it's another area, but it's a very interesting question, and I hope we pick up on that through the discussion. And also it would be interesting, you've mentioned other people's experiences. It would be interesting if this can continue on the Futurelearn step, where people can come in and add their own experiences of what's been helpful, what their experiences are, because it's not just about us.
And also remember that this course is available for another 2 weeks, but after that, of course, it closes. So what we could suggest is that you can continue, if it's available to you, continue the discussion on the Facebook site that we have created.
That's we should say avenue. We know it's not ideal because some people don't use Facebook.
No.
We don't want to necessarily endorse.
No, but it's what we've got at the moment until we've got something better, you know. So please don't feel that once the course finishes, you know, that's it, the door is closed. But, you know, there is a way of continuing the discussion. And, you know, Amy mentions her project. There must be a lot of you involved in projects. So if we can, for the moment, keep contact through the Facebook group, this would be a step in the right direction. Shall we move on to another one of Amy's questions?
Absolutely,
because she has contributed quite a lot here. She asks ideas and resources for making EMI students and lecturers more aware of their relative strengths and weaknesses, which individual areas to improve and how, especially for those under time pressure. Well, Rob, you've already talked about the pressures on the academics. There are pressures on students as well, of course, because EMI might only be a part of their experience in their university life. Only, you know, some of their courses might be delivered through the medium of English, others not. We don't know. There's as many permutations as there are universities and courses, so we don't know exactly what the situations are. We've mentioned questionnaires, we've mentioned discussions. I was thinking that discussion in the classroom with the students is possibly the ideal, backed up by written comments, because we know that there are people in classrooms who are a little bit shy. But maybe that just isn't possible given the constraints of time and so on. So maybe snapshots in the form of questionnaires is the best that you can hope for at a given moment. And if that's the best you can do in your situation, then that's better than nothing. And very often we would like more detailed feedback from our students, but we just there just aren't the means to do it. So do what you can and be happy with that, and you know, and be proud for having that at least as a start, and things will get better.
Yeah, and I'd add the also what underlies this question, I think, is empathy. And seeing empathy as a quality that you can develop, as in almost like a radar for understanding people's feeling. So this is about, to understand my strengths and my weaknesses, I have to have an understanding of how people are reacting to me. And a lot of research suggests that the best way to do that is to have individual contact with people. When you have contact with people as a group, it can actually reinforce your group thinking. So I can treat these people as students, one group. I perceive them as students because I don't interact with them individually and understand variation in how they perceive me and my behavior. So I'd say encouraging students and teachers to individualize, to speak to people and work with people as much as possible on an individual level increases people's awareness more than a lot of training courses. Because I've worked a lot with intercultural communication, and lots of the research there suggests that you can talk to people a lot, that you should be empathetic. This is how stereotyping works, things like that. But that's cognitive knowledge, which doesn't necessarily trickle down and affect your deeper thinking and your behavior. It doesn't necessarily affect your sort of the attitude that's buried deep within you that you don't necessarily access consciously while you're thinking. So I think the way to get people to be more aware of their strengths and their weaknesses is to have more interpersonal interaction with, let's say, for example, with Winnie, Mimi, and Jamie in the classroom, rather than this group of students.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? Because I can understand, say, here we have lots of Chinese students coming to the UK at the moment. And if I know them as the Chinese students, I'm going to have a very limited understanding of how they engage with me. If they becomes 3 different people, then I understand 3 different people's stories, 3 different people's way of engaging with me. And that makes me a better teacher, because I'm teaching a room of 40 individuals rather than a room of Chinese students.
Yes.
And I think that's important to develop. So if you're developing teacher education programs or student education programs for EMI, I think it's important that they actively engage in discussion, meaningful discussion with each other about the educational experience. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, and I would add that it's easy to give up, because you may have 40, 400 students and you think, I can't get to know all of them. Very often as teachers, we are perfectionists, and so we think, well, if I can't get to know all of them, then I don't want to know these 3. What did you call them?
I can't remember.
Mimi?
Mimi was one of them.
Winnie
Jamie.
and Jamie.
Yes.
Where did you get those names from? I wonder. Anyway, even if you do only get to know a few of those students, it does give you some knowledge and some insight. And you can't know everybody. And you're just doing the best with what you have.
Yes. And it's,
yeah.
I was going to say, it's the basis of how we know things in this field.
Yes.
Because with humans, I think you can know what's possible. You can never know what's going to happen. So knowing Mimi, Jamie,
and Winnie.
And I always forget Winnie. Poor Winnie. But yeah, knowing them means that I know what's possible for other people to experience. I know there's diversity. And that's what I meant by my empathy goes up, because I know them as people. And but we can never, some people might have like a quantitative questionnaire to understand what do Chinese students think when they come to the UK. That questionnaire will fail, because you're dehumanizing the Chinese students who come to the UK, and you're treating them as one group, which they're not. And and that doesn't help me become empathetic. That makes me a cold, hard numbers person. And I apologize to any statisticians watching this. You can see which kind of field we live in.
Yeah. I don't know if it's ever possible to talk about empathy with students, whether that kind of dialogue is one that can be had. I'm just throwing that out as a question and not really expecting an answer. But I guess in an ideal world, one would be explaining to the students exactly where we're coming from and applying it to the EMI course in particular. Well, I just don't know if it's possible, but maybe it could be, and it would be lovely to hear from teachers such as yourselves in the future who have been able to have a discussion of this nature, going way beyond course content to the kind of things that Rob has been talking about. Would that be possible? It'd be lovely to do research in that area and find out more about what's happening at this level. However, I am aware of time constraints. So can we move on to another question, Rob, which is about ideas for encouraging home and overseas students to mix, engage with, and help each other? I mean, in a way, this is not EMI, is it? It's the international university that we're talking about, and any kind of international learning situation. And this is something that, you know, I would love to hear from you on the step. You know, once you've listened to us ranting on for, I don't know, about half an hour or so, whether you would like to put some of your ideas of things that you have done on the step for others to learn. Because, I mean, there's only the two of us with our limited experience. It would be wonderful to hear what people have done in different countries, different situations, in order to get home and overseas students to mix. Do you have like one best idea, Rob?
Oh, I've got more than that, Mary.
We haven't got time for all of your ideas.
I was going to add lots of ideas, because I teach an intercultural communication module, and one of the assessment tasks is for students to design activities and events that bring people together interculturally. So avoiding your stereotypical, let's say, oh, we're going to have Indian dance over here, Thai food over there, and we're summarizing these
Chinese
enjoying
and
superficial elements of people's cultures. And they come up with very interesting ideas around, but mostly they center around the opportunity for people to talk about the meaning of or the meanings that are important to them, their experiences in the university, beyond the university. So they've designed events, for example, where perhaps you go around and there's a theme around particular groups of people who identify as a group, and they present their experiences of how they've perhaps experienced the university setting, things that they found strange, things that they found difficult, barriers that they perceive, and people can engage in that kind of conversation. We've had that quiz events. You know, students tend to find things that are quite fun more appealing than things that are very dry and academic, which we tend to encourage students to be involved with. So things like quiz events, music events, comedy events, you know, things where people can go and have fun together and engage in a different way from how they engage in the university.
Yes.
That's a way of, also team building courses. They tend to access things like, you know, you, as a team, you have to get over an assault course or climb a wall together or something like that. And they work because, you know, that you put people in a situation where it's not about where you're from. It's not about who you are. It's about how you're feeling at a particular moment and how you can work together to achieve a goal. And it could be physical. It could be sort of designing something, challenging something, engaging with something. But often working in a team where you have a challenge is another good way.
It's another good way.
Because it gives you something to do that's not about who you are. It's about working with others. So I think that it's very interesting, the ideas they come up with and what they're interested in. I think, actually that would work better than something I might think of as a teacher, because it's very pedagogical and people don't always like that.
My advice is to try and get away from words and to become focused perhaps on the visual. So the kind of things that I've done that I've found successful are, for example, students taking photographs of things that they don't understand or find funny, or things from their own culture that they would like to show, because now we can find pictures so easily on the internet, finding pictures that they can show of, I remember students bringing in pictures of buildings in their hometowns and so on. And I found that taking pictures in and around Southampton, bringing in pictures of their home cities. Drawing as well frees up people from the words, and that can be a way in to sharing experiences and showing and telling and stimulating discussion and provoking questions. So I find the visual very, very helpful.
I had a lovely moment with one student when I think it was something like meaningful moments in your life, or things that raise your anxiety, something like that. And the whole group came together around a photograph someone showed of, I think it was just where she'd dropped her son at school for the first time in another country. And it's just the way she'd taken the photo with the child walking away. And it's kind of like everyone was,
yes, that would be
changed the whole atmosphere of the group after that, because again, it's very humanizing. Everyone can relate to that,
and it accesses the emotions and so on, which we don't do so much in the classroom.
We avoid emotions,
don't we? Yeah, we don't like emotions. I'm not going to burst into tears or anything to embarrass you, but that's the kind of thing that we do avoid. So to do the opposite of what we normally do is, I think, what between us is what we're saying. Okay. Amy has another question, if we could move on, Rob.
Thank you,
she
Amy.
asks about teaching materials that actively promote ELF usage over NS standard, native speaker standard. And I think that is something that, perhaps we could think about, because ELF has now been around for enough time for it to sort of like filter through into practical publications. And there are course books now that talk about ELF as opposed to standard English and so on. So it would be a question of looking through publishers' catalogues and looking at descriptions of new materials coming through to see what they say about the kind of English they use and promote, whether they are using just a standard English or whether they do embrace different varieties of English, or at least different accents. That would be something to look for, because obviously it takes a long time, doesn't it, for publishers to create course books and so on, and for them to be available globally to people. Some of them might not be exactly what we would hope for, but perhaps just exposure to different accents would be a first step along the way, in my view. I don't think it's our place really to recommend specific books here.
I was going to say,
we
mentioned before the filming that there's a new book called Teaching English as a Lingua Franca, from EFL to ELF. But again, we, having not read it or used it, I'm not sure.
We can't promote that, can we? We don't know.
But I like what Henry Widdowson said. So we had a conference on English as a Lingua Franca at the University of Southampton, and there was a panel during the conference, and he said, you don't need to change teaching materials, you need to change how you teach and how you talk about language. And I think that's the key thing, is with English as a lingua franca, you're looking at language use, and there's so much language use. If we look online, we can find millions of examples of speakers using English in various ways that achieves intelligibility. There's so much writing that's available, that students have written, or that's available online, which doesn't necessarily conform to this idea of native speaker English. And I think actually for me, I find teaching using authentic materials, using what the students produce, is a way of bringing ELF into the classroom. And it's not that different from communicative approaches to teaching, where they say, allow space for error. English as a lingua franca wouldn't say, or researchers wouldn't call them errors necessarily. But learning a language involves a lot of trial and error. It involves having freedom to express yourself that doesn't immediately conform to one set way of teaching. And the problem with teaching materials is they're often designed to teach sentence structures or to teach specific vocabulary use in a very restrictive model, but you don't have to teach it in that way, and you can adapt or talk about the language or get students to actually produce the language in a way that's less constrained. And I think that's an important thing to mention. I don't think you can make an ELF book that tells you
these
what...
people have.
Oh, sorry, I shouldn't say that. Might be rude.
Yes.
But no, they're approaching the topic.
Yeah.
But the thing is that ELF is so varied. You could have an Indian who's been speaking English for 4 years speaking to a Singaporean who's grown up with English for 35 years, talking to each other. That would be ELF, as would a German person speaking to a Dutch person at a very high level of proficiency in a management meeting. They're both ELF. The language forms you will see would be very different. The communication norms, and we probably draw people's attention to how people communicate, how is it successful or unsuccessful, and doing that in one course book or in one language teaching resource is very hard. And it's much easier for the teacher to create it for your students and your audience from real examples, rather than a course book creator trying to artificially say this is ELF, because it's so varied.
It is so varied, but I do sympathise with teachers who do not have the time to look around and find the kind of materials that we would wish for in this like perfect ELF course book, if we could possibly imagine it. And I think it would be lovely if there were some kind of source of materials available to people who could then, which they could then dip into, knowing that these materials would provide the kind of variety and so forth that they're looking for, because we do know how hard it is for teachers to find the time, to get the right sort of material. So maybe that's a job for us in the future, Rob. We'll create a bank of materials for you to dip into.
But it does make me think that, because like one of the main things with English as a lingua franca is that standard English materials have existed for a very long time, and they've never produced standard English. So it's not like reading standard English is making people reproduce standard English ideology.
No.
So you don't necessarily need to find like non-standard examples of writing. You simply have to have a discussion about writing that's functional and an open mind to say what students produce might be different from what you're giving them. Likewise with communication, recognizing variability. But yeah, you're right. I do sympathize as well. I've sympathized with myself many times trying to come up with classes.
Exactly. Yeah. So sometimes it's easier just to go to the basic material that your students produce and use that as your starting point, rather to imagine that there is a perfect solution out there. Maybe there isn't. Maybe the perfect solution is what you have right in front of you.
And the problem can be in the discourse of teaching. Like, what are we teaching? And often language teachers, the idea is that we are teaching language, like a sequence of words that go together in a particular way that you put in people's heads. And I think, avoiding that assumption is an important element. And lots of course books have that as their starting point. You want one achievable aim in every class that's related to grammar and related to other areas. Whereas perhaps I'd say promoting English as a lingua franca might completely switch that around and say our focus is on recognizing communication and communicating perhaps like coherence effectively.
Exactly.
And this, that's varied,
This does lead into the question that Rachel asked. She says, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on assessment. We know that the focus needs to be on the content, but what about language? So I think we're sort of halfway to answering Rachel's question here, in the sense that if we approach the teaching of language in a different way, the kind of way that Rob has just described, then the assessment automatically, as a result, changes. And until assessment in general of the English language changes, and we're talking about massive changes on the part of examination boards, international examination boards, and examination boards within a country and so on, then until those change in some way, then there is going to be a problem for the teacher of English as opposed to the EMI teacher. But then that rebounds onto the EMI teacher because questions of assessment come in with regards to the teaching of the content. So it's a massive area. I can't see there being an answer, or certainly not a neat answer to this, for a long time to come. I don't know about you, but so much needs to change in people's minds, their mindset, for anything like this to happen.
And in relation to teaching to assessing EMI, I think so how we assess it, I think it's an educational principle which should be there for me always. You assess the learning objectives of your course. How you assess language within that, and I don't mean assess the language, I mean assess elements of communication that you can put down to language. How you assess that should link directly into the learning objectives of the course. Absolutely. If you're finding that your assessments are assessing students' language or are discriminating against students' language, even though their content knowledge is very good, then I would look at that assessment, look at your learning objectives and how the assessment is failing to be effective in you assessing the learning objectives directly, and you've ended up assessing the language. Classic examples are like when students struggle with the format of an assessment, they don't understand what it is. I know that there are some modules here that use like annotated bibliographies. So students have to say what literature have they used for their dissertation and what do they give them? And the students don't understand what an annotated bibliography is. They don't know how to write one. They can't write one. They fail to write one, and then they get a really low score. Yes. With that, I'd say it's not part of students' academic literacy. It's not part of their abilities, their set of abilities to be able to produce an annotated bibliography to the level the course wants. And therefore, I'd say, well, they should change the assessment method or teach students more effectively what an annotated bibliography is. So that's just one example. But you're quite right. The focus needs to be on the content. But some courses use English because they require people to be qualified in using English for that subject. For example, medicine. If you're giving someone a certificate that says you can conduct a medical meeting through the medium of English, you don't want to give that certificate to someone who knows medical terms in their own language but can't communicate in English, because then you're giving them a qualification that won't reflect their ability to do the job. So it really depends on the course, and some courses will have a language component or a communication component that says the assessment part of the course objectives are you need to do this in English, so we have to assess your ability to do it in English. Some other courses, the English is just the medium. English is a communication tool, and then if you're assessing their English rather than their content knowledge and their ability to communicate, you've got a problem.
Yeah. I think what we're saying throughout this discussion is I think we're identifying the need for individualization and personalization in your particular context, which we've said before, but it really is coming through as a result of the questions that we've had and the discussion that we've been having today. And also recognizing that you can only do what you can do, because you've got the pressures of perhaps authorities above you, whether you are allowed to assess students in the way you would like to assess them, you may not have that freedom. You've got other pressures from all different sides. We needn't go into listing all of those, but you can only do what you can do in your situation at the moment. And our aim on this MOOC is to support you in your approach to that teaching and use of language, that you feel confident and clear that you are doing the best for your students in the circumstances that you find yourself in. Because no doubt there are lots of things that you would like to change with your teaching situation. I know that things that we might like to change, we can't do that. We just do our best in the situation that we're in. And so I think my message would be, okay, identify your parameters, what power you have in your situation, and then do what you can do with confidence. And if you can't do everything that you wish that you could do, then okay, acknowledge that, and things will change, we hope, in the years to come. And you may well be able to explore avenues of teaching through the medium of English, assessing your students and so on, in ways that are not possible at the moment, but could well be. And the way to gain your strength is by working with your colleagues together to exchange good practice and to continue, if possible, to communicate with people outside of your country who maybe have similar situations and could be a wealth of support for you.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is sometimes institutions can be resistant. For example, if you say, I want to have discussion board, which has, say, like weekly contributions from students that are much shorter and easier to communicate for them, you might want to include that, but then the institution might be resistant because they say, we don't have this kind of assessment anywhere else, and I'm a bit nervous about meeting quality standards and things like that. That's when you go and you network and you look for other people in the university and outside the university who put that into practice, and then come back and say, it does happen.
It does happen, yes.
And asking people, what's the best way of assessing this? If you notice your assessment has a particular problem or is going against your principles or your teaching or whatever it may be. So I think definitely networking, developing your understanding of possible responses.
I think we should be drawing this to a close now, Rob. And just to repeat the networking, we are available for another 2 weeks online on the MOOC site to answer questions. And if you can post responses to some of the things that we've been talking about today in this step, that would be good. And then those of you who do have access to the Facebook group, that's another avenue that you can explore for networking and the sharing of ideas. And it may change in the future. We never know.
Yes.
We don't know what we can do.
Basically, we want to start a discussion. We don't want to end the discussion.
No, we are facilitators of the discussion. We're not the people with the answers. We want to make it possible for you. And we are exploring ways that we can support your discussions and support you. It'd be lovely to hear from, for example, Amy. Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you to all the other people who've
and
Rachel who've over the weeks participated and made such wonderful contributions in the discussions. But Amy talks about the project that she's engaged upon. I really want to know about your project, Amy. So I'm looking forward at some point in the future to hearing from you and to find out what you did, how it went, what you got out of it. Are you going to publish a report on your project? Wouldn't that be fabulous? Wouldn't it be lovely to think that in a few years' time, people who've participated on this MOOC actually publish And, we could look at some papers and think, yes, the origins, might trace back to something that was said by somebody on this MOOC. Wouldn't that be lovely, Rob?
It would be lovely.
Would be lovely.
Delightful. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So it's sad, but we do have to say goodbye.
Yes.
But we're still here.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching, for participating, and engaging. It's been
Thank you
fun.
very much indeed.
Oh dear.
What?
We've got a question.
We've got a question.
A
What's
final
this?
question. What is the impact of Brexit on ELF?
Oh, crumbs.
Well,
you know what today is, or was going to be.
Or was it today?
It's today, but it's not today, is it?
It's not today.
It's the non-B day.
If
you can say that, the non-Brexit day. I don't like
Yes. Well, I would say.
Yes.
I'll link this forward. I think it's very interesting because I've been discussing it in one of my modules. And it's the assumption. So sometimes people assume English is the global language. English is the global lingua franca. That's what Latin thought. That's what German thought in academic publishing, French at times as well. There's not a necessary kind of assumption that English will remain the dominant language in education. I think there's certainly a case for multilingualism. There are other global languages which are becoming more global, and I think certainly developments in America. I think America has been the main driving force of modern power of English. Britain was the driving force of colonialization and the spread of English nationally. But I think Brexit, Donald Trump, these kind of things where the power centers of English become more isolated, become less engaged in what are the mega structures of power in the world. I'd say they could have an impact on the medium used in education. They, in Europe, they might make it policy to say, okay, we're going to want, multiple languages to be present and no one medium to be followed. And relationships with China might be affected, and they might say, we're not going to follow English so enthusiastically. And yet their EMI might go from an explosion to a slightly smaller phenomenon. And we don't know. So we don't know that this is a continuing trend that will continue forever. English as a lingua franca will be there where people communicate. But I've used Mandarin as a lingua franca before in Thailand. Other lingua francas are available.
They are indeed, yes.
So my personal take is it shows us that politics changes, power structures change, countries' positioning changes. And we always have to think about that the medium of instruction is not a neutral choice. It's not just pragmatic. There are a lot of historical factors that go into it. And we're seeing historical change in the positioning of Britain, the positioning of America, and it could have impact on relationships with other countries.
I wouldn't worry about it for the time being, to be honest. I feel that for the next few years, we're safe in our EMI world because we don't know what's going to happen. If we do start contemplating too much, too far into the future, it creates anxiety. So I think this is an area where we can just be safe for the moment and sort of know what's happening with an eye to the future that long term this could change. I mean, changes that we're thinking about don't happen overnight. It takes a long time. So maybe EMI and English in Europe is one issue, as opposed to EMI and the use of English globally in the rest of the world is another issue. Perhaps that's something that could happen, but I don't know.
And I think the decision making really is among powerful groups, because quite often English learning is driven by people who are advantaged by English. So people who you know, if you get a high level of education, you can get a better job through English. If they decide English is not the best way, or is not the symbolic power that you can have in the global marketplace, something else becomes more powerful. So that's the real decision-making area for me.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're seeing.
Yeah. So thank you for that last question.
Yes.
That
Thank
was
you, Chrissy.
interesting. It'll be interesting, you know, when we run the MOOC the next time. June, I think it is, or July.
June, yes.
There might be a different perspective. Things might have happened by then. I don't know.
Yes.
Okay.
We might have had to sell our video cameras because we don't have EU funding anymore. So
yes, that's possible.
We might have to run this on the phone.
Yes, yeah. Anyway, I think we'd better say goodbye, haven't we? All right. So
thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Do keep in touch. It's so important. All right. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. I'll end the stream.